A 94-year-old man was dying in a hospital in New York, and the last thing he heard about his own life's work was that it was over. 4 days earlier, his company had told a bankruptcy court it would close every single store in America, Toys R Us. The chain he built from a Washington, D.C. furniture shop into the biggest toy store on earth. Charles Lazarus did not live to see the liquidation trucks pull up. He died on March 22, 2018, 4 days after the company announced it was shutting down for good. Here is the part nobody tells you. Lazarus did not just build a toy store. He invented an entire way of killing other businesses. He called his stores category killers, one giant shop that buried every small toy shop within driving distance. For 40 years, it worked. And then, in the final act of his life, Toys R Us watched a different kind of category killer. This one built out of warehouses and code instead of concrete. Do to his company exactly what his company had done to everyone else. This is not a story about Amazon destroying a dinosaur. It is a story about a company that taught the world how to kill a competitor and then forgot to defend itself against its own weapon. By the end, you will see the deal, the debt, and the decade Toys R Us spent trusting the wrong partner, and understand exactly why the empire that invented the rules could not survive them. Charles Lazarus came home from World War II, a cryptographer, a man trained to notice patterns other people missed. In 1948, he opened a small children's furniture shop in Washington, D.C., selling cribs and bicycles out of his father's old store. He noticed something simple. Parents did not come back to buy a second crib. A family only needed one crib. But they came back constantly for toys, because a child outgrows a toy every few months and wants a new one. Furniture was a one-time sale. Toys were a subscription nobody had named yet. In 1957, Lazarus opened a store dedicated entirely to toys in Rockville, Maryland, and named it Toys R Us, with the R turned backwards, so it looked like a child had written it. What made the store dangerous was not the toys, it was the size and the calendar. Every other toy seller in America treated toys as a Christmas sideline, stocking a few shelves in November and clearing them out in January. Lazarus stocked toys year-round, in stores the size of an aircraft hangar, at prices small shops could not match. Retail analysts later gave this tactic a name, the category killer. One dominant store, purpose-built to bury every smaller competitor in its category. Over the next 3 decades, Toys R Us did exactly that, spreading across American suburbs and then overseas, into Canada, into Japan, into dozens of countries, while thousands of independent toy stores quietly closed their doors. By the early 2000s, the company operated more than 1,500 stores worldwide. Lazarus had built the most efficient toy-killing machine retail had ever seen. He had no idea he was also writing the instructions for his own funeral. By the year 2000, Toys R Us was not just a store, it was a fixture of American childhood. The backwards R logo, the mascot, Jeffrey the Giraffe. The jingle almost every kid born after 1980 could hum from memory. I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid. The company generated more than $11 billion a year in revenue and controlled somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of all toy sales in the United States, depending on which year you measured. It was, without argument, the biggest toy retailer that had ever existed. The company was ambitious enough to believe it could dominate the next frontier too. The internet was arriving, and in the late 90s, Toys R Us tried building its own website, its own warehouses, its own delivery network for online orders. It did not go well. During the 1999 holiday season, the company's own site fell so far behind on shipments that it had to publicly apologize to customers and pay a fine to regulators for missed delivery promises. For a company that had built its entire identity on being the biggest, most reliable option in its category, failing at fulfillment in front of the whole country was humiliating. Toys R Us decided it needed a partner who actually understood how to run a warehouse built for the internet instead of a parking lot. It found one. The partner's name was Amazon. In August 2000, Toys R Us and Amazon announced a 10-year partnership. Amazon would run the technology, the warehouses, the shipping, the entire back end of an online toy store. In exchange, Toys R Us would pay Amazon roughly $50 million a year, plus a cut of every sale, and in return, Toys R Us would be the exclusive seller of toys and baby products anywhere on Amazon's platform. On paper, it looked like the smartest deal in retail. Toys R Us got to keep its brand and its buying power without ever having to solve the warehouse problem that had embarrassed it a year earlier. Amazon, a company still years away from turning a profit, got a guaranteed $50 million a year and instant credibility as a place families trusted to buy for their kids. For a few years, the joint store worked exactly as promised and became one of the most visited shopping sites on the internet. But there was a quiet cost buried in the arrangement that nobody at Toys R Us fully priced in at the time. By handing its entire online strategy to a partner, Toys R Us spent the exact years the internet was being built, roughly 2000 through 2004, doing almost nothing to build its own digital muscle. It was not learning how to run a warehouse for the internet age. It was renting someone else's. And the someone else it was renting from had every incentive in the world to learn everything it could, and none at all to keep its promise. By 2004, Toys R Us noticed something was wrong. Toys and baby products from other sellers, companies that were supposed to be locked out under the exclusivity agreement, were showing up for sale on Amazon anyway. Toys R Us sued. The case dragged through New Jersey courts for 2 years. In 2006, a judge ruled that Amazon had, in fact, breached the agreement and damaged the unique value Toys R Us had paid for, and allowed Toys R Us to walk away from the contract. In 2009, Amazon finally agreed to pay $51 million to fully settle the dispute. On paper, Toys R Us won. It got its money and its independence back. But look at what the win actually cost. The lawsuit and the wind-down process meant Toys R Us did not fully control its own online store again until deep into the mid-2000s, nearly a full decade after the internet retail land grab had begun. By then, Amazon was no longer a toy seller's convenient technology partner. It had used those same warehouse years, the years Toys R Us had effectively outsourced away, to become the single largest and most efficient retailer on the internet, selling everything from books to diapers to, yes, toys, at a scale no single category specialist could match. This was the fatal logic sitting underneath the whole story. Toys R Us had invented the category killer, a strategy built entirely on being bigger, faster, and more available than every rival. Then, at the exact moment, a new kind of category killer was being built out of code and warehouses. Toys R Us chose to rent that capability instead of owning it. The rules it wrote for everyone else were now being used against it. While Toys R Us was fighting Amazon in court, its own board had already decided the company needed to change hands entirely. Sales had gone flat. Big box rivals like Walmart and Target were undercutting toy prices as loss leaders to pull families into their stores for everything else. In March 2005, the Toys R Us board agreed to sell the entire company to a group of investors, the private equity firms KKR and Bain Capital, alongside the real estate giant Vornado Realty Trust, for $6.6 billion. The deal closed in July 2005. The buyers put in about $1.6 billion of their own money and borrowed the rest, loading more than $5 billion of debt directly onto Toys R Us itself. This is how a leveraged buyout works. The investors do not pay for the company with their own cash. They make the company borrow the money to pay for itself, then hand the bill to the company they just bought. On the same day the deal closed, KKR, Bain, and Vornado signed themselves an advisory agreement guaranteeing $15 million a year in fees, growing 5% annually, on top of transaction fees every time the company's debt was refinanced. Toys R Us was no longer just competing against Amazon and Walmart for customers. It was now also carrying a $5 billion anchor chained to it by the very people who were supposed to be steering the ship. For the next 12 years, Toys R Us tried to run a retail business while paying roughly $400 million a year just in interest on its debt. That is money that never went into new stores, a real e-commerce platform, or better prices. It went straight to bondholders and banks. The company had not turned an annual profit since 2013. In the quarter ending in April 2017 alone, it lost $164 million. On September 18, 2017, Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the United States and Canada, hoping a fresh $2 billion in emergency financing could get it through one more holiday season and buy time to restructure. It did not work. Holiday sales came in below the targets its own lenders had set as a condition of that financing, triggering default clauses buried in the loan agreements. On March 15, 2018, with no plan left and no buyer willing to take on the debt, Toys R Us moved in bankruptcy court to liquidate its entire U.S. business, all 800 stores. 7 days later, on March 22nd, Charles Lazarus died in New York at 94 years old, 4 days after the liquidation was made public. He never saw the closing day itself. Liquidation sales began on March 23rd. The company's website went dark on March 29th. A last-ditch $890 million bid by toy executive Isaac Larian to save the U.S. stores collapsed by the end of April. On June 29, 2018, the final American Toys R Us stores closed their doors for good, 70 years after Lazarus opened his first furniture shop. Here is the number that belongs next to every other number in this story. Between 2005 and 2017, while Toys R Us bled cash and eventually collapsed, the three firms that bought it and loaded it with debt, KKR, Bain Capital and Vornado, collected $464 million from the company in advisory fees, transaction fees, and interest payments. That money came directly from Toys R Us, the same company that could not find $400 million a year to build a real website or renovate its aging stores. The firms were not paid for saving the company. They were paid for owning the debt that was slowly killing it. Whether the company thrived or collapsed made almost no difference to their return. Around 33,000 employees lost their jobs when the U.S. stores closed and were later found to be owed roughly $75 million in severance that the bankruptcy estate never paid. There is a brutal symmetry hiding in all of this. Toys R Us spent decades perfecting a business model built on being bigger and more efficient than everyone smaller than it, a category killer that took no prisoners. In its final years, it became prey to the exact same logic, this time played by financiers who were bigger, faster, and more efficient at extracting value than Toys R Us could ever be at generating it. The predator had simply changed shape. The easy version of this story blames Amazon. It is a satisfying villain, and it is wrong, or at least incomplete. Amazon did not force Toys R Us to sign away its online future for a decade. It did not force the board to sell the company to private equity in 2005. It did not force KKR, Bain, and Vornado to pile $5 billion of debt onto a retailer that would soon need every spare dollar to survive a changing industry. The real lesson sits underneath all of it. Toys R Us was, for most of its history, the most disciplined company in America at understanding one thing. Whoever controls the biggest, most efficient version of a category wins, and everyone else disappears. It built an empire on that single insight. And then, at two separate moments, when that exact insight mattered most. In 2000, when it rented its digital future instead of building it. And in 2005, when it let outside investors load it with debt instead of protecting its own balance sheet, it forgot to apply the lesson to itself. A company can spend 70 years mastering how a category gets killed and still not recognize the shape of its own death coming. Charles Lazarus taught American retail how the category killer works. He never got to see how the lesson finally came due. Toys R Us is not an isolated story. It sits in a long line of companies that built genuine, dominant empires and then lost them, not always to a smarter competitor, but sometimes to their own debt, their own decisions, or their own blind spots. If this channel has taught you anything, it is that the fall of an empire almost never looks like the story you were told growing up. If you want to understand exactly how a company invents the very weapon that later gets used against it, look at what happened when Kodak invented the digital camera and buried it to protect film. The pattern repeats more often than anyone in a boardroom wants to admit. Subscribe if you want the next one, and tell me in the comments, which empire should we take apart next?